So when I think about Black history, so I've been around for a little while now, so quickly approaching middle age, as I say. I've been around for a little while now, and I've been through lots of Black History Months, and I enjoy the month. But one thing that I find is that often we discuss some of the same characters over and over again, okay? So we know about Dr. King. We know about Malcolm X, okay? And so some of us, though, even though we think we know some of these figures, we would be surprised at some of the other things that we don't know about even them. So we know a little bit about some of these figures. We've heard excerpts from Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. We may have seen Spike Lee's Malcolm X movie 30 years ago. Even though it's a great movie, there's so much more to learn about Malcolm X. And so the theme that I really want to go through here today is the real breadth, depth, and longevity of Black history. There is so much variation in what we would call the Black American experience, okay? Usually when we think about Black history, what do our minds automatically go to? We think about Black Americans marching during the Civil Rights Movement down in Montgomery or Selma, or we think about slavery. So we think about Black slaves on a big plantation, we think Gone with the Wind, and that's really about it, okay? But there's so much more to Black history than that, okay? I like to say we have been an inextricable part of the American story since even before the Republic was founded, all right? So you all know names like Christopher Columbus, okay? Or explorers like Hernando de Soto, who we learned in 4th grade may have come through the state of Alabama in the 1500s. There's one name you may not know though. His name is Juan Garrido. Say that with me. Juan Garrido, okay? Juan Garrido was a Black man that was born in the Kingdom of Congo in the late 1400s. Now that is in Central Africa, in present-day Angola, okay? Somehow he makes his way all the way up to Portugal and then to Spain. From Spain, he sails with an explorer, a European explorer by the name of Ponce de Leon, a French man, and they end up making it in 1513 to what we now know as Florida, okay? This man was not a slave. We know that he was free, okay? And so he participated in many expeditions that explored the southern United States. Not only did this man do this, but also he wrote to the King of Spain in 1538 asking that the king reward him for his exertions on behalf of the Spanish crown. So this is King Charles V, and he actually responds, gives him land and a pension to live on for the rest of his life, and he establishes a wheat farm in what is today Mexico. All right. So we have been here from before the beginning, but even under slavery, okay, Black Americans, even though they were denied their ability to benefit from the fruits of their own labor, the Black experience included more variety than we often allow, okay? So images of slavery do flood our mind during Black History Month, but according to the 1830 census, Black slave owners, Blacks who owned slaves themselves, accounted for 2% of the free Black population, okay? Now, just to put that into perspective, so many people may have heard of Black slave owners, sure, okay? So chase on, but that should have been an infinitesimally small number. Not as small as you might think. When you compare that to the white Southern population, only 6% owned slaves. So as a free white person, you were only 3 times more likely to own a slave than a free Black person, okay? So I got this information from the Journal of Southern History. Then, a lot of times we think of Black slave owners as being more benevolent. So sure, they may have purchased their family members to keep the family together. This is what we refer to in history as the Woodson thesis. Just like Pastor Woodall mentioned, Carter G. Woodson, this was his thesis, okay? But later historians have come along and challenged this thesis, saying that Black slave owners may have been just as exploitative as their white counterparts, okay? And so we even have some newspaper clippings of black slave owners putting notices in the paper that their slaves ran away and they wanted to bring them back, okay? So there's a historian, Larry Coger, very intelligent man, wrote a book about this where he examined South Carolina slaveholders, and he refers to some of this. So just to mention a couple, James Pendarvis was a South Carolina rice and cotton planter. He died in 1798. When he died, he owned 155 slaves and 3,000 acres of land there in South Carolina. Andrew Durnford, all right, died in 1859. This is a Louisiana sugar planter. At his death, he owned 77 slaves. And in 1850, at the height of his influence and wealth, he had land holdings valued at $82,800, $3 million in today's money. And just to think about this, at that time, most Louisiana farm makers, white or black, whatever, if they were free, were only making $153 a year. And this man has holdings of $3 million. So incredible, okay? So these wealthy blacks are the predecessors to the class of people that I wrote about in my thesis, okay? And so we're looking at the late 19th, early 20th century, and I'm looking at the black elite, and I'm specifically looking at the Washington, D.C. area. Now, when you think about the black elite, so you may think of some rich blacks that you thought of like Madam C.J. Walker or Jack Johnson. Madam C.J. Walker, first black millionaire, surely she'd be considered a part of the black elite. No, not necessarily, and we'll see why in just a second, okay? Also, Jack Johnson. Anybody know who Jack Johnson was? First black heavyweight champion of the world, absolutely, okay? Jack Johnson was so rich and he loved to work on cars, okay? He loved to get them to go faster and faster. So one day he was speeding down a Georgia highway. Police officer stops him, all right, and gives him a citation, all right? Gives him a ticket for $50. Jack Johnson pulls out a big wad of cash and hands this officer a $100 bill. And this officer says back to him, I can't change this. I don't have $50 to give back to you. Jack Johnson says, don't worry about it. I'll be speeding back through the same way I came. So, these people are not considered part of the black elite, okay? So what are some characteristics that we're looking for? So we're looking at an emphasis on respectability and decorum. That was very important to the black elite. So not being ostentatious, not laughing loudly in public, as they would say, making a spectacle of oneself. But also, I thought it very interesting. I've always been just in love with black worship and how we worship God and some of our cultural attributes as far as our worship. But the black elite were very serious about being very decorum or having a lot of decorum in their worship as well. So they did not appreciate the shouting and moaning and clapping that we often associate with black worship, okay? I actually found a quote that was very interesting to me from a man named Roscoe Bruce, and he was born into the black elite. We'll talk a little bit about his family in just a little bit. So he was the son of the first black senator to serve a full term, but he expressed some of this disdain for the loudness of black worship when he visited Tuskegee Institute in 1902. So he was an educator, so he taught there, and he just wanted to visit just to check things out. And during one of the evenings, some of the students put together a revival meeting. So they were going to meet. You can imagine, these are students that have saved all their money to come to school. They don't have much, and they want to spend their evenings worshiping God. So he went to this revival meeting expecting to see a nice worship service, and he goes and he is surprised at what he sees. He calls it a reversion to barbarism. He says the antics of the preacher and the students were disgusting. Such nonsense ought to be stopped at once. I, for one, shall never attend such a performance again. So that was their value, this decorum in their worship as well. We also see them emphasizing financial stability. Many of them own businesses, education as well. So at a time when most Americans, black or white, weren't going to college, they valued that college education, okay, throughout their families. Also, there is social connection as well. So they're in societies like the Bethel Literary Society in Washington, D.C., where they host speakers, they have musicals, they give teas and things like that. So this is definitely high society stuff. Last big factor is what we call the color factor. Historian Willard Gatewood deals with this very much so. So color and lineage. Many of them were descended from prominent whites. So we look at, for instance, the Civic family. The Civic family was very proud of being descended from Martha Washington, the president's wife, being descended from her grandson. Okay? And so we see lots of European admixture there. So most of them were pretty light-skinned, like we see in this picture here. So this is Josephine Wilson Bruce. Josephine Wilson Bruce. So she was born into a prominent Philadelphia family in 1853. Her father was a dentist, Dr. Joseph Wilson. And in 1841, so this is before the Civil War, before emancipation, in 1841, her father published a book called Sketches of the Higher Classes of Colored Society in Philadelphia. So they were very much at the center of high society in Philadelphia. Now you can imagine, as a parent, wouldn't you be proud if your daughter brought home a sitting U.S. senator with an 800-acre plantation in Mississippi? Wouldn't you be at least intrigued? You know, you did pretty well, okay? Well, her family was interested, but had some misgivings, because even though her fiance was a senator, he was quite a bit darker than them, and also had done manual labor as well early on in his life, and was born a slave, whereas they had been free for multiple generations, okay? But anyway, she did marry Blanche Kelso Bruce, who was the first black man to finish his Senate term. This is in the U.S. Senate. Now, they were so wealthy that they took a 4-month honeymoon to Europe, right? This is in 1878, okay? And she spends money over there in Europe at the House of Worth, which is a huge fashion house at the time, famous for dressing the Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, etc. So this is really impressive stuff. They sent their son, they only had one child, they sent their son, Roscoe, the man I mentioned a few minutes ago, to Phillips Exeter Academy, which is still a very prestigious academy in New England, and then on to Harvard, where he graduated. She was not just a pretty face, though. So she served as a hostess for other congressmen's wives, but she did lectures herself around the country in advocating for black rights on behalf of things like lynching, voting rights, and things like that. So she had some intelligence as well. Last thing I want to say about Miss Bruce is she also experienced some color prejudice in her life as well, but not in the way that we might think. She was a member of what was called the National Association of Colored Women. In 1906, they had a meeting in Detroit, and she thought she would put her name forward to run as president. But there was serious misgiving about that from some of the women in the organization. They preferred a woman who had more African ancestry. And I found a quote from someone who expressed what the opposition was. They said, "We prefer a woman who is altogether Negro, because while the lighter women have been the greatest leaders and are among the most brilliant in the association, their cleverness and ability is attributed to their white blood. We want to demonstrate that the African is as talented." So she would pull her name out of consideration, and this was in the papers and everything, all right? Last man that I want to introduce to you today, this is probably my favorite of the black elite. So he was a huge fan of history. This is Daniel Alexander Payne Murray. So very much at the center of the black elite in the Washington, D.C. area as well. His claim to fame is that for 41 years, he was an assistant librarian of Congress, okay? And that's really bigger than we might think. So what does that mean? He helped people check out books in the Library of Congress? No. So he is doing research for senators and congressmen as they draft legislation, as they give speeches. So this man is having a direct influence on the legislation that's coming out of the national conference. He was born free in Baltimore, so he started out free. Another claim to fame is that he spent most of his life working on an encyclopedia that would catalog the writings of black writers. So he wanted to show that blacks were putting out literary output just like whites as well. Another thing I want to say, so this is February. Last month we inaugurated a new president, okay? And so every administration we have these inaugural balls, okay? And so this time the Black Conservative Federation did a ball for President Trump. In 2009, the hip hop inaugural ball was done for President Obama. It was hosted by people we know like Russell Simmons and LL Cool J. But we have a longer history than that with these inaugural balls. In 1897, this man is the chair for the inaugural ball, the black inaugural ball for President William McKinley. And it is a well-anticipated affair. The paper, even before the ball happened, said that this ball will eclipse any social function ever attempted by the colored people of Washington, D.C. And it did. It was an amazing affair. He had a whole staff to put everything together, and I can just imagine these people decked out in their tuxedos and top hats welcoming President McKinley. All right. So what can we take from this as Christians? And I'll get out of your way. So the black elite may not have been perfect, okay? They may have, as we say, thought of themselves more highly than they ought, okay? But if we look at ourselves, we are not without fault as well, okay? But one thing we can see throughout their stories is a sense of service, okay? So they may not be perfect, but they are doing things to help their communities and to give back. And like them, we have that opportunity as well to reach out to our fellow man. Songwriter said, "What shall I render unto God? For all his blessings we can serve. We can serve our fellow man." Colossians 3:23 through 24 says, "Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ." Thank you so much.